Hello, beautiful, and welcome to the Moms Talks Sex podcast. I'm your host, Maura Yelvington of Morph Transform Your Reality, where I help women step out of trauma and reclaim their power. I'm so happy to have you here for this open conversation about moms, sex, motherhood, children, relationships, marriage, and everything in between. So grab your drink of choice and let's dive in. So honored to have the beautiful Laken here with me today. Hi, Laken.
Hi,
How are you doing?
I am doing well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing great. I am so excited for this conversation because I feel like so many women are struggling with what we're going to talk about, but they don't even know they're struggling with it. And so I'm really excited to dive in. But before we do that, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and what you do?
Absolutely. So my name is Laken Litton. I am an ADHD millennial coach. I help late diagnosed or suspected ADHD millennial women learn to harness their ADHD as a strength so that they can manage their time and be productive without the burnout or guilt.
I love that. And we were talking a little bit earlier how most women don't even know that they're diagnosed, that they have ADHD, right? So what are some signs maybe that we should be looking out for?
Sure. So a couple of things that tend to be a marker is um, late diagnosed or suspected ADHD women tend to have a lot of anxiety and depression that have resulted from years of coping with the ADHD without being treated. And so if you're a highly anxious, highly depressed person, and you just can't seem to find that right combination of meds or tactics to kind of work with your brain, there may be something else going on there. I will disclaimer this by saying I am not a doctor. If you believe that something is going on, you should follow up with a medical professional. But different things such as, do you struggle to focus? Do you have to be constantly multitasking? Are you a chronic perfectionist or overachiever? Are you a chronic people pleaser? Do you, do you forget a lot of appointments? Or on the opposite side of that, have you forgotten so many appointments that now you overcompensate and literally everything goes into your calendar to make sure that you don't forget? Are you guilting and shaming yourself for not doing that load of dishes that's in the sink, but you just can't seem to move yourself off the couch? Those are some signs that there may be some executive function issues going on. And so definitely worth a conversation to see whether or not it's worth being evaluated.
It's so interesting because I feel like those symptoms are also trauma-rooted symptoms. So yes, ADHD, but as a woman working with women for over 18 years, those are all signs of hidden trauma and trauma in the body that we're not aware of. So I'm curious, do you think they're connected? Because now that we're talking about it, I'm like, I wonder how much trauma actually ignites ADHD.
Absolutely. And they are noticing that there is quite a correlation between childhood trauma and ADHD in women. They've not proven that the two are actually connected or that there's any kind of causation, but there's definitely that correlation and very similar symptoms from both.
Wow, that's so fascinating, especially as someone that went through trauma and has ADHD. So it's just funny that our body is reacting in certain ways. And for me, on my own healing journey, what I realized was that I was so disconnected from my body that my body was just functioning differently than me. It was this complete disconnect. And the minute I connected myself back into my body and made my body a safe place to be in, it seemed like a lot of the ADHD stuff just kind of drifted off and away, which has shifted a lot. So it's interesting. So how is this connected to sex into our bedroom? Because we are talking about sex here on the podcast. So how
Yeah,
is it related?
absolutely. Yeah, for sure. So it may or may not be a known fact, especially since you do have ADHD, that, for ADHD women in the bedroom, it can be very hard to pay attention. you know, a lot of neurotypical women talk about how hard it is to stay in the moment or, different things like that. And when we have ADHD on top of it, like, not only do we need to feel connected to our partner, not only do we need, to be in the moment, not only do we need to be turned on, but like we also need to like turn the ceiling fan off before it clicks one more dang time in order for us to enjoy this. So it definitely plays a part, because that lack of focus, that lack of executive function, it can make it really difficult sometimes to really get in the moment or to share that intimacy with your partner. Um, Vice versa. Sometimes, like we mentioned, it can be linked to trauma as well. There may be no interest in sex, or there may be an over interest in sex.
Yeah.
It depends on, first of all, the person's experiences and preferences, but also there is a lot of studies showing that there are some ADHDers who use sex as one of their forms of dopamine, and so they tend to be on the more hypersexual side. Whereas others, they just can't seem to find the executive function for it. It's just one more thing on their to-do list almost, especially for women, and they just don't want to do it. So you kind of see both ends of the spectrum. Of course, it ranges all the way in between, but it's definitely much more of a struggle for us because we're trying to be present in our bodies, present in the moment, present with our partner, and present in our brains to where we don't have 30,000 thoughts going on as we're doing something.
Oh my gosh, you're talking and I just see my whole life flashing in front of me. Like, yep, yep, yep. I do all of that.
Same.
I do think there's somewhat of a superpower to it, right? Because we can get so much more done than a normal person. I think, like in a regular day, I get that all the time from people like, how do you do all that? Like, I don't know. I'm just used to doing it. And I still have time for sex, which is great.
Yeah,
But,
absolutely.
it's not great if your partner is not compliant with that, right? Because that can create a big dissatisfaction in a relationship. Like you were saying, if women are more hyper sexual or not. So that can seem like it can create a big friction in a relationship. So what do you tell your clients that you work with, right? What kind of tips can we give the women listening that are finding themselves identifying with the information that you're giving, right? What can they do? What can they do to stay in the moment, or what can they do to communicate that? Like, what would be, and we can talk about some tips.
Absolutely. One thing that it gets talked about all the time and we tend to dismiss it is that communication piece. You want to be comfortable enough with your partner to be able to discuss that and clue them in that, hey, it's not that I'm not into you, it's not that you're doing anything wrong, it's just this is what my brain is doing. It's one of those things that you don't want to like all of a sudden just like get up and walk. So this has happened. I will share an experience. My current partner and I, we both have ADHD, and so things get real fun around here. I'll just say that. But when we find time for each other, there was one instance where like we were right in the middle of it. We had finished, and like I don't know why, but just all of a sudden I got up, left the room, and I went and got a bowl of ice cream. And he's like, how long have you been waiting to go get that ice cream? I'm like, I really don't know. Like something just switched in my brain that was like, I need ice cream and I need ice cream in this moment. Like it was not stopping. And, we still to this day laugh about it because he's like, yeah, ice cream turns her on more than me. Which of course he knows is not the case. But, that's just a perfect example of like, I went full ADHD. Like that was my hyper focus in that moment. And I was just on it. And so like, I came back with my bowl of ice cream and he's like, what? I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. Did you want some too? So yeah.
Hey, sex and ice cream go really good together. I support that notion.
Absolutely.
But it's funny because when you're talking about it, I'm thinking to myself, I had to stop listening to music, not intentionally, but I realized that when we had music going on, especially if it was like really wordy music, I would just totally tune into the music. And that would just not turn me off, but I would just be somewhere else, like you said. My brain just goes somewhere else. So it's very interesting. So do you have any tips to like what you can do to focus back into so let's say this is happening, right? You're having sex and your brain is traveling. How can you get back to that moment? How can you come back to where you are?
So a couple of different things come to mind. The first is even just cluing your partner in that, like, hey, I'm starting to wander a little bit, will kind of actually bring you back to the present. And it will also clue them in that, hey, if I'm acting a little bit differently, or if I seem like I'm losing interest, like I'm not. Because what can happen sometimes is, as you're finding your center and you're coming back to the present, they already think that you've lost interest, and so they're winding down.
Right.
So it can help to kind of just be transparent about it, but also, mindfulness techniques, grounding yourself, what can you see, what can you touch, what can you hear, bringing yourself back into the present moment. And something to proactively do is, if, like in my house, we have a son, and so the bedroom tends to be like the only place that we're able to do anything. And so we have done everything we can to make that environment as ADHD friendly as possible, so that when we are able to steal a few moments here and there, we don't have those extra distractions. And so we kind of make sure, like, we don't tend to use candles or music or things like that, just because the smells and the sounds, like you said, if there's extra words in the songs, we tend to focus on them, and different things like that. And so we just, over time, we've communicated, we've learned each other's triggers, we've learned what tends to kind of pull us out of the moment, and then we've made accommodations to work around those things if possible, just to kind of minimize the number of distractions that are in the room.
I love that so much. Maybe you can share a few of distractions. So I'm just curious, if you're a woman listening and you're like, okay, maybe you can give a little bit more detail to see if maybe, somebody listening and like, oh, wait, I do this, I do that. Maybe from your own experience, if you don't mind sharing.
Yeah, of course. So let me think.
What are some distractions that would come up for you, for example, that you can maybe identify for some of us?
Mhm. A couple things that would come up for me is, I have a lot of sensory things. And so if I am uncomfortable, or I'm laying on like a blanket that's not necessarily comfortable, I can't pay any attention. It just doesn't happen. And so, we make sure that the bedding, or, whatever it is actually like comfortable for me, so that I'm not dealing with some form of sensory input that is turning me off. Another thing, my dogs might bark in a second. Sorry. Another thing is the dogs barking. That tends to get in the way. Or the dogs wandering into the room. So a lot of times, even if my son's not home, we lock the bedroom door or shut the bedroom door, just so that the dogs can't, mosey on in and cause distraction. Another thing too is our clothing. For my significant other, if I am wearing something with like a pattern on it, it can actually distract him. And so if I'm wearing something in particular, I usually make sure that it's a solid color or a consistent material, because if it's actually different, the textures actually can distract him from the moment. So
Wow, that's so interesting. I think these are things that people normally won't even think about, and then won't realize that that's why they're not having sex, right? They're not even aware that it could be a pattern on a shirt or a texture that's turning them off. So this is really huge, I think, for a lot of people to bring awareness to this, because maybe just changing the mood in the bedroom can create more sexual relationship, more intimacy with your partner. And maybe it's not you, maybe your partner has ADHD. So what can you do to accommodate them? Like, I love what you share, that you guys both are sharing this together so you can work on it together. But if you have one person that is ADHD and another person that doesn't, especially if we're not aware that we have ADHD, right? How do we kind of bridge that gap and make it a safe environment, quote unquote, to allow more of that passion in the bedroom?
yeah, definitely. And it a lot of it does boil back to the communication and the openness. and feeling safe enough with your partner to share those things so that you are able to bridge that gap and work through them. And one more example came to mind, actually, and this is one that women probably almost never talk about, is if you get swept up in the moment, something like that, and then you have to use the bathroom, or
Oh,
your partner has to use the bathroom, and like you don't want to kill the mood, so you don't want to say anything, and so you try and don't pay attention to it. That's another situation that like you could have that problem where you are so distracted by that that you can't get into the mood, or you're afraid that you're going to completely kill the mood and lose your hyper focus because you have to stop for a moment. So that's another example too that a lot of women don't like to talk about or think about. Is something like that. And then also in the case of like my significant other, we tend to have to shut like the bathroom door in our master bedroom, because if there are any kind of like shower smells or anything like that that's coming out because like one of us freshly showered or somebody used the toilet, those smells also can get in the way. So those are just a couple other things that came to mind.
wow, that's really interesting. And so I'm curious, like, what made you, when did you become aware of your own ADHD, um, and identify that and know that that's going on, and and it's time to take care of it because it's actually preventing you from living the life that you want to have.
Yeah, of course. So I also have a history of trauma. And as I was growing up and as I was a young adult, I was misdiagnosed as bipolar. And I also went through a diagnosis of depression and anxiety, as well as, PTSD, CPTSD. But no matter what I did, I just couldn't seem to get my brain on track. I just couldn't seem to pull myself present. I couldn't stop disassociating. I was just really, really struggling. And so it was right around the time of the pandemic that I had moved, and I was living with a roommate for the first time in my life. And there were certain things that would happen that would just drive me bonkers. And I started to fall down the OCD rabbit hole of trying to find out what was going on with me. And so between that and also at the time we were realizing that my son was exhibiting signs of being autistic, I also kind of fell down that rabbit hole. And so as I was researching and researching and researching, I came across ADHD in women. And I read a lot. I kind of did a lot of self-reflection, and then I spoke to my doctor. And that is one of the things that I actually coach my clients on, is how to advocate for themselves in the doctor's office. And, I spoke to the doctor, did the evaluations, and turns out, hey, I have ADHD. And that's
Yeah.
why the medications didn't work for me, because it was an issue with the ADHD. It wasn't like bipolar or something that required more antidepressants.
Wow, amazing. It's also amazing how those misdiagnoses with medication can really put you in a different place, because it
Mhm.
seems like the minute you got on the right kind of medication, that stuff probably subsided.
It did, absolutely. And of course, any medication, it's probably not going to be the absolute cure-all. There's going to be some lifestyle changes involved as well. But once I was able to actually get my brain on track, be able to focus and pay attention, then I was able to implement those tools to continue to work with my ADHD, to be able to time manage, to be able to be productive, to get my projects done on time, and also to work through that burnout and shame of like, oh my gosh, why can't I adult? Why can't I just be like everybody else? Why is this so difficult for me?
Right.
Being able to work through those has been a real game changer.
That's amazing. So you would say you would definitely recommend a combination of medication and self-healing, I should say.
Absolutely. And that goes for anything.
Right.
A lot of people confuse coaching with therapy. And the best way to look at it is, therapy helps you heal from the past and explain why things happened. But coaching kind of helps project you forward and helps you reach your goals and live the life that you want. And so while both are very important and have their place, both can also be very beneficial in addressing those different aspects of your life, coming to accept yourself for who you are, and using the strength and the skills and even the superpowers that you have to live that life that you want.
Yes, I love that so much. So if our clients want to find you, where can they find you?
Sure. So you can find me on Facebook. We have a group called Mindful Millennials with ADHD, and it is a coaching community. You can also find me on Sleek Bio, that is SleekBio.com/Laken Litton, and that's LakenLitton.
Love it. Well, thank you so much for being here. This was such an eye-opening conversation, I think, to many women and men listening.
Hello, beautiful, and welcome to the Moms Talks Sex podcast. I'm your host, Maura Yelvington of Morph Transform Your Reality, where I help women step out of trauma and reclaim their power. I'm so happy to have you here for this open conversation about moms, sex, motherhood, children, relationships.